America and in the rest of the world starting in 2008, because I think that you can sort of look at that crisis that Argentina had on a small scale. I even think that we were sort of a case study in a way. The powers that be sort of said, let's sink Argentina into a full-fledged crisis and see how the whole system works, the crisis system works, and how we can micro or macro manage it. And they did it very well to their interests, not to ours. But it helps to understand what is happening ever since September 2008 in America and in the rest of the world.
So do you think that we're on borrowed time? Is that how you feel?
Yes, because we were on borrowed time too. You could tell in 1999, 2000 that Argentina was headed way in the wrong direction, and we had a very stupid president at that time, a guy by the name of De La Rua, and he brought back what the very economy minister that the previous president had, who really was the architect of the whole economic crisis. It was sort of like, Timothy Geithner, Larry Summers, Robert Rubin were the actual architects in the last years of the Clinton administration for everything that then happened the full lack of control of the financial system. And what does Obama do? He brings them back. He brings Timothy Geithner, he brings Robert Rubin, he brings the very architects of the whole crisis back to try and solve it. That's like giving a monkey to take care of a banana shop, so to speak. You can imagine what the result is going to be. And in that, I would just, if you allow me, I would just like to briefly mention that, everybody talks about, or they talked about Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi pyramid scheme. Right. And what people don't realize is that if you look at it, the whole global financial system or Argentina's financial system on a smaller scale, they are all global Ponzi pyramids. And like every good pyramid, a good pyramid has four sides. And this system also has four sides. Let me just very, very briefly mention what those four sides. The first side is to control the central bank of a country, put it under private control, not because of any specific direct control from the bankers themselves, but ensure that the central bank, the Federal Reserve in your case, the Argentine Central Bank, will always issue insufficient amounts of money. Now, that's not happening now, but that did happen until 2008, where if you look at the figures of actual dollar bills circulating, you will see that it's really a very small figure, and that brings in the second side of the pyramid. Since people, individuals, companies, governments need to do things and need money, and there's not enough public money, so to speak, the dollar bill notes in your wallet to go around, in come the bankers saying, you need money, we'll lend you money. Do everything with banking money. So we'll create it out of nothing through the leverage enabled by the fractional lending system, and we'll charge interest on top of that fake money. It's a great business for them. So that's the second side of the pyramid. The third side of the pyramid is that they seem to have talked everybody into the idea that if you want to do anything, whether as an individual, an organization, or a government, you have to do it on the basis of debt. There's no other way of doing it. So we're all indebted, individuals, corporations, and governments, for trillions upon trillions of dollars the world over. And the obvious question is, if we're all indebted to whom? And that brings the fourth side of the pyramid, which is the ones that we were able to live very, very closely. And that is that this whole system has an internal logic. When it's in the growth mode, they activate channels that will make sure that all those huge profits, whether it be from the derivatives market or from hedge funds or from speculation or from whatever, or the rising stock exchange, that all those profits will go into the hands that they want, the private hands that they want, whether it be CEO bonuses or specific investors or specific banks and so forth. And when the system is about to collapse because it just cannot hold anymore, and they know when the time comes, they will automatically activate new channels, which is to socialize all the losses. And that is exactly what's been happening to America with all these gigantic bailouts with taxpayer money for the banks. And that is what is about to happen now, with the Federal Reserve issuing more and more money. In other words, debasing the U.S. dollar, where not only will the American people pay for that, but the whole world will pay, because the dollar is basically a global currency.
John, I know you got questions for Adrian. Why don't you shoot one his way?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joe. Adrian, the Federal Reserve can print money, endless amounts of money, and they can keep throwing more money at this economy, and call it quantitative easing, while most of Europe is instituting austerity measures. All good things must come to an end. About the absolute maximum that they can throw at this, how long do we have? Do we have 5 years? Do we have 2 years? I can sit here and I can see that we're about ready to hit the proverbial wall. But how far back can it get pushed?
Well, John, it would be a bit conceited from my side to say, 4 years, 6 months, and 3 weeks, because it's very difficult to tell the timing on this. I think that the first thing, we have to take this a step at a time, is to understand the mechanism. When you understand the mechanism, you can start sort of saying, okay, let's start putting a timeline on this. Let me give you an example. Why do I think, maybe I'm wrong, that the mechanism, and I described it in much greater detail in a couple of videos. I just tried to make a very, very, quick recap. Why do I think that this four-sided Ponzi pyramid global financial system works the way I just mentioned? In other words, controlling public money, replacing it with banking, private money, making us all believe that you have to do everything on debt, and then having this cyclical mechanism I just mentioned of privatizing the profits and socializing the losses. Because in Argentina, the cycle itself is very short. In other words, every 15 to 17 years, Argentina collapses. As I said, we collapsed in 75, we collapsed in 1989, we collapsed in 2001 and 2002, and I tremble to think when we're going to be collapsing next. In the world, or in America especially, the powers that be were able to make the whole cycle last 80 years. In other words, the Great Depression in 1929, 1930, and then they made it last until 2007, 2008. That's almost 80 years. So for you guys, the last time that this major collapse had occurred, the 1930s, for most of you, especially you, Joe, that you're the youngster in the group. For you, it's just a black and white picture that you've seen in textbooks saying these are people lining up in the 1930s for, I don't know, a dish of soup at a community kitchen. You never actually lived it yourself, or at most you might remember that your granddad said, oh, the Great Depression, it was terrible. You didn't know how bad we had it. We had the Hoovervilles and nobody had a job and everything. It's something that you read about or some old guy told you about, but you never actually lived through it. However, I've got kids who are in their late 20s and early 30s, and the last crisis, they lived through it. They know. They were affected tremendously by it. So there's a big difference between what you read in a textbook when you try to understand it and what you actually live through yourself. So in the case of Argentina, it's like every 17 years or so. In the case of America, I think that probably the most tragic years, going back to what you were mentioning at the beginning of the show, what was just said about quantitative easing, is that Obama lost the two critical, vital years, early 2009 until today, where he could have taken all the necessary measures, and he did not take one single measure except continuing to help the big banks, and that is all he did. So now they have in other words, they put in tons of money into the banks, into AIG, even saving GM, and now they realize that it just didn't work. The thing just it's spiraling downwards. So what's the Fed going to do? What's Mr. Bernanke going to do now? Quantitative easing too. He's going to put even further money into it. And now let me just rewind to our hyperinflation crisis of 1989. What is hyperinflation? What is inflation basically? Yes, it's when the government issues a lot of money. Okay, they issue a lot of notes. But as long as you have trust in the money, and it's like the naked emperor. Everybody sees he's naked, but nobody dares to say, hey, the emperor is naked, until one little girl, very innocently, says, hey, the emperor is naked, and she is saying what is obvious to all. With inflation, the same thing happens. Nobody dares say, hey, the dollar is really a hyperinflated currency. But the day that happens, there will be a run. Like when they tell you, hey, your bank is bust, what does everybody do? They run to the bank. Mm-hmm. Literally a run on the bank. So the day we have the loss of trust in the public in America and throughout the world in the U.S. dollar, you will have a run that might literally run its course in 24 hours. That's the terrible part.
And you stated that Argentina has had 3 collapses within your lifetime. How did they handle their economic collapse? Did they print more money and throw at it, or did they issue some severe austerity measures like they're doing in Europe?
Well, austerity measures, John, are always there because austerity measures are what's normally required, at least in weaker countries like our own, by the IMF. Although, mind you, I remember that in the 70s, the IMF also required austerity measures of more powerful countries like Britain. So the austerity measure is always there because when you have these collapses, the powers that be will always find a way of socializing these losses, and they do that through control over government, saying the government, you have to raise taxes, you have to lower social benefits, or what's happening in France, your people cannot retire at 60, they're going to have to retire at 62, and let's see what happens because they might end up retiring at 64. We don't know yet. In other words, there are a whole myriad of mechanisms whereby you can socialize all these losses and so forth. But what normally happens, and in the case of Argentina, it really goes into the nitty-gritty of the problem, because just before our last collapse in 2001, 2002, as I say, the government was not issuing enough public money, public pesos, like the money I call public money, the banknotes you have in your wallet. I mean, that's real money. Everything else is fake. It's just something that appears on the screen on your ATM machine, or some bank prints on a paper when they send you the statement of account. That's not money. I mean, it's money as long as the whole system works. When the system collapses, I mean, it's like the ATM screen just going off. It's off, and that's it. You have nothing there. At least the dollar bills you have in your wallet still have some value, and they will continue having some value for a while. Well, that public money, as I call it, the Argentine government, they were so put up against the wall by the IMF that they did not issue sufficient pesos for the needs of the national economy. And what happened? We have 24 provinces, like you have states in America. Of those 24 provinces, 16 said, hey, hold on a minute, I've got to pay the teachers' salaries, I've got to pay the police, I've got to pay the fire brigade, I've got to pay a whole host of everyday things. And each province started to issue their own provincial money, which was technically a bond, but it worked like local money because they made it look like almost a counterpart of the real national or federal money. And what happened? It worked because teachers received their salary in that money, but they realized that they can then go to the grocery store and pay for their groceries with that, and they could even pay their taxes with that, and they can pay for their gasoline with that, and even among several of those provinces, they would even accept each other's provincial money. So it worked. But what is it? It works so well, and as I say, you go into the nitty-gritty of what money really is, that it did not have inflationary effect. Why? Because the provinces were merely monetizing the economy to its real need. So that it works so well that when we finally did come back to some sort of stability in 2003, one of the first things that the IMF did, and this sort of tells you where the truth lies, one of the first things they did is they told the government, withdraw all those provincial monies, replace them with federal Argentine pesos, and so that those pesos will not be quote-unquote inflationary, you're going to back them with dollars through an $800 million World Bank loan. So what happened? Something that worked wonderfully well with real currency. We withdrew them, replaced them with pesos, and those pesos are now backed with an $800 million loan, which means we have a further debt with the World Bank for $800 million. Ridiculous.
That's incredible, isn't it, Griff? And it's so good to hear. That's the beauty of the internet, that here we have Adrian from Argentina telling us about these events as they happen down there, and we're facing it here in the United States, just the beginning of it. But, he was talking about inflation, and, of course, I think I've said it on the show before, we've seen prices start to go up here. Just at Walmart, the average price increase, 77%.
Wow.
That's significant. That's real significant. Don't you think, Griff?
Yes, I have so many questions for you, Adrian. Are you ready?
Shoot.
Okay. The IMF and World Bank, all of those organizations are private companies. They don't belong to government. How do you define them in your mind?
Well, I think that they are. I agree with you. It's just like the Federal Reserve Bank is really a private company and so forth. But I think that this all ties in with the engineering that they are doing on a more global level. I mean, you guys know that since the end of World War II, even before, but let's just put